Welcome back to Dentro La Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. Let's continue with the second episode of our mini-series, the one we started a few days ago, and that will guide you through this month of April. A mini-series dedicated to the liberation, that is, April 1945. In the first episode, which you can find on the channel if you missed it, we talked about the life of Benito Mussolini in his last year. So in 1944, the beginning of 1945, everything that happened, the evolution of his role within the Italian Social Republic, the speech at the Teatro Lirico in Milan, and much more. Today we are dealing with the topic of the Italian Social Republic, the RSI, this state that was born after September 8, 1943, after Mussolini was freed from the prison of Campo Inferno. The operation on Gran Sasso is bound to create controversy even within historical research, and especially among public opinion. Because when we talk about the RSI, the Italian Social Republic, we are talking about an autonomous state with its own specific characteristics, with its own dignity, even legal dignity, or simply a satellite state, a puppet state, created from nothing just to give Nazi Germany another convenient ally. Today we will try to clarify this issue. For Dentro La Storia, always with the usual satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. The Italian Social Republic. The RSI was proclaimed on September 23, 1943, and it is certainly one of the most controversial episodes in contemporary Italian history. Born in the context of the crisis of the fascist regime and the German occupation of central and northern Italy, the RSI was a state without full sovereignty, deeply influenced by Nazi Germany and marked by the struggle for liberation, which involved the country until the spring of 1945. To understand the birth of the RSI, it is necessary to start from the events that led to the fall of the fascist regime on July 25, 1943, following the Allied landing in Sicily and the progressive worsening of the military situation. The Grand Council of Fascism had approved a motion proposed by Grandi, which withdrew confidence from Benito Mussolini. King Vittorio Emanuele III, who until then had remained almost on the sidelines observing, decided to intervene by having the Duce arrested, entrusting the government to Marshal Pietro Badoglio. The new government had formally declared the continuation of military activities alongside Nazi Germany, but in secret had started negotiations with the Allies. These negotiations would lead, as we know, to the signing of the armistice. Shortly after it was made public on September 8, 1943, the announcement was made over the radio. It caught the Italian army and the other armed forces unprepared, causing a widespread collapse of military and administrative structures. In addition, the German forces, which were already present in the area supposedly as a guarantee, played a role. In reality, to prevent Italy from leaving the conflict, we carried out Operation Axe, occupying most of the peninsula and forcibly disarming the Italian troops. Up to this point, the story is well known. On September 12, 1943, a German commando freed Mussolini from the prison of Campo Imperatore and transported him to Germany. The dictator had been convinced, or perhaps forced, albeit in a friendly manner, by his old friend and comrade Adolf Hitler to return to Italy to lead a new fascist state. About 10 days later, we come to September 23, 1943, when the birth of the Italian Social Republic was announced, with its nominal capital in Rome. In reality, the actual headquarters was on Lake Garda, after the same German troops who had freed Mussolini deemed the Rocca delle Caminate in the province of Forlì indefensible and therefore unsuitable. Mussolini had initially wanted to establish his residence and operational headquarters there. The RSI presents itself as a continuation of fascism, but in reality it is a profoundly different entity. First of all, the choice of the Republican form, the RSI defines itself as a republic, formally marks a drastic break with the Savoy monarchy. It is a choice also due to the accusation of betrayal made by the fascists against King Vittorio Emanuele III. almost as if to forget that it was the hierarchs themselves who had decreed the end of fascism. Within the Grand Council, within this republic that also presents measures to strengthen defense, which merges into a single ministry the functions of the Ministry of War and the Ministry of the Navy, Mussolini takes on the title of head of state. Another novelty, at least for Italy, but it was essentially a repetition of what Hitler had done in Germany several years earlier. After the death of the president of the Reich, Hindenburg, the new regime tries to relaunch itself through a revolutionary rhetoric that culminates in the Congress of Verona in November 1943, which we already talked about in the previous video. The document drafted during the Congress of Verona outlines the principles of the so-called socialization of enterprises, which was supposed to involve workers in the management of companies. In reality, these projects remain only on paper, hindered by the war situation, by subordination to German interests, and by the hostility of the big entrepreneurs themselves, big industrialists who have no intention of handing over their companies to a fascist-style state collectivization. The ideology within the Italian Social Republic also accentuates some radical traits of fascism, such as that anti-Semitism, which for a long time was denied as a distinctive feature, as if it were just a sort of mistake made with the racial laws of 1938, a mistake prompted by the alliance with Hitler. It returns forcefully in the Italian Social Republic. In November 1943, it was the Italian Social Republic itself that declared Jewish citizens as foreigners belonging to an enemy nationality. All this made it possible to carry out continuous deportations of Jews to extermination camps. The Republican fascist authorities, in this sense, actively collaborated with the roundups. The famous one, which took place in the Roman ghetto in October 1943, but also elsewhere. And this shows how the post-war rhetoric portraying fascism as absolutely not anti-Semitic is historically wrong, not to mention an actual manipulation of history itself. On the military front, the RSI tries to rebuild its own apparatus through the creation of what is called the Republican National Army. Along with this, the Republican National Guard and the Black Brigades, the latter, established in 1944, become a central tool in the repression of the partisan movement. But the Republican armed forces, later disparagingly called Republican, are born with a major problem. The vast majority of Italian soldiers who had been disarmed and captured by the Germans and later transferred to prison camps in Germany had refused the possibility of negotiating. Rebuilding the apparatus through the Republican National Guard, its restructuring, was established during its reorganization. The last German Guard brigades are clear. Only a small portion of the interned Italian soldiers agree to return and fight for fascism, for Mussolini. Hundreds of thousands remain in Germany, taking what would later be defined as a silent, passive, but extremely dignified opposition to fascism and Nazism. They are the IMIs, the military internees, a group that should be recognized within the Italian resistance because it is a form of resistance unlike the others. It is a resistance that does not recognize fascism, but actually opposes it as an enemy of Italy. With this premise, the RSI forces are extremely weak. They are based on reworked formations that make use of the remnants of what is gathered from various warehouses or disbanded units. Sometimes they benefit from German weaponry, but essentially they have an extremely limited combat capability. The war in northern Italy gradually takes on, over the months, the contours of a fratricidal conflict. On one side, there are the forces of the RSI and German units. On the other, as we know, the partisan formations materially supported by the Allies. It's a guerrilla war, an urban guerrilla war, a guerrilla war in the countryside, a guerrilla war in the mountains, a guerrilla war that is followed by harsh reprisals, massacres, and violence against the civilian population. In all this, the RSI stands out for its full compliance with the Germans and for its attempts, sometimes even grotesque, to call young Italian citizens to arms. The forced conscription actually results less in desertions than in a general refusal by young people to answer the call. And this shows, once again, how the RSI was perceived by Italian citizens. They certainly did not see it as a state or as a national institution. It was seen only as a tool of the German occupiers. Episodes like the massacres of civilians, torture, and summary executions carried out not only by the Germans, but also by fascist gangs like the Black Brigades, had contributed to creating a widespread climate of terror. Although the RSI claimed its own autonomy, it can be said that its participation in repressive policies, often in collaboration with the German authorities, had alienated the sympathies of the vast majority of the population. Moving on to the economy, to the productive and financial side, the RSI operated under extremely difficult conditions. The infrastructure was constantly being damaged by Allied bombings, resources were scarce, and a large part of the production was destined for the German war effort. It's telling that the Germans themselves reviewed Italian military production, deciding which weapons should continue to be produced, not in favor of the RSI, but in favor of the O'Hare. Think about this. The P-2640 tank, the first Italian heavy tank, which basically hadn't even had time to fight against the Allies. It had been put back into production, along with several tank destroyers, which were positively evaluated by the German Armaments Inspectorate, mainly to equip German units. This shows how the economy was basically subordinated to the war needs of Germany, which requisitioned raw materials and industrial products. Not only did it continue to organize convoys of forced laborers, theoretically volunteers, but actually slaves, to be sent to Germany to work in factories. The daily life of the population was marked by deprivation, ration cards for heating, and insecurity. In this context, many young people tried to avoid compulsory enlistment, as we said, by hiding or joining the resistance. The cities, frequently hit by bombings, still managed not to become completely depopulated. And this is a particular element that shows how the resilience of the average Italian citizen led them to try to protect their own home, both from Allied bombings and from the violence and abuses of the Nazi occupiers and their fascist allies. During 1944 and later in the first months of 1945, the situation of the Italian Social Republic became increasingly precarious. The Allied troops advancing from the south, the partisan activity intensifying despite the Alexander Proclamation, and Germany now struggling on all fronts, no longer able to provide effective support. These are all factors that deepen and accelerate the crisis of the Italian Social Republic, making it irreversible. In April 1945, the final Allied offensive and the general insurrection, proclaimed by the National Liberation Committee of Northern Italy, led to the definitive collapse of the Italian Social Republic. As we know, Mussolini tries to escape to Switzerland, but he is captured by the partisans and executed by firing squad. With the end of the Italian Social Republic, an era comes to a close, the era of fascism in Italy. But that Italian Social Republic still needs to be analyzed, because throughout history, it has been the subject of numerous interpretations. Most historians consider it a simple puppet state, lacking real autonomy. However, some historians emphasize the presence of elements of ideological radicalization. The RSI is seen as an extreme phase of fascism, which abandons the previous phase, the one marked by symbiosis with the monarchy, becoming a radical splinter, bringing out the worst sides of fascism itself, which had been almost buried during the long pact with the monarchy, to show the true face of Mussolini's movement. The memory of the RSI has long been divisive in Italian society. For decades, the resistance movement rightly portrayed the fighters of the RSI as lackeys of Germany. In recent years, a different approach has developed, and there has been an attempt to introduce a theme, that of the Civil War, which we will explore in a new video in a few days. Please be patient. But our question, the initial question, is still there. Was the RSI an autonomous state or a puppet state? So let's take a moment to draw a conclusion. The RSI could not exist independently. It didn't have the strength, the resources, it didn't have the energy, it didn't have enough military forces to guarantee its own independence, it didn't have control over its own state. Some areas had been ceded by the RSI. The Adriatic Operation Zone, Istria, Trieste, Friuli, the Belluno area, the Alpine Foreland, that is Trentino and Alto Adige, were simply handed over to German control. So, de jure still part of the Italian Social Republic, but de facto given by Mussolini to Hitler in exchange for military help. Military sovereignty was one of total subordination.
Esercito della RSI.
It had real combat capability, but it was inferior and totally dependent on the German armed forces, who certainly did not use the National Republican Army on the front lines against the Allies. The main operations decided by the German commanders used the RSI manpower in the repression of the resistance, in which the Republican units were nevertheless supported or even led by the German ones. In practice, the RSI did not decide the war on its own territory, it endured it. As for political sovereignty, it was extremely limited. Yes, Mussolini was the head of state, but he had returned to power only thanks to the German intervention. He had to guarantee the alliance with Hitler, and the crucial decisions, from the war to the deportations, were entirely aligned with German interests. Mussolini had no leeway, he was not independent, he was a pawn. Diplomatic sovereignty was non-existent. The RSI was recognized only by Germany and its few allies. The RSI had no embassies in neutral countries, such as Switzerland, Spain, or Portugal. The foreign policy of the RSI had no autonomy and could not be considered credible. No one gave any credit to the RSI. The economy, as I mentioned, was oriented toward the German war effort. Industrial resources and raw materials were requisitioned by the Germans. The projects, such as that socialization, that kind of collectivization of industrial production, largely remained on paper because it was impossible to implement them, and because of opposition from many sides, starting with the industrialists, those industrialists who had financed and supported fascism, and who, in the final phase of the war, almost repudiated it. The spaces for autonomy within the RSI were real, but extremely limited. It was a sort of lifeless puppet. The administration, the police, the propaganda, yes, they were autonomous. The internal organization of their own militias was autonomous. There was a certain margin in internal policies, especially at the ideological and repressive level, but nothing that amounted to a truly independent line in domestic policy. In conclusion, the RSI can be defined as a kind of gray area, an intermediate zone, a state that formally existed but was essentially dependent. Not a fully sovereign state. It can't even be defined as a simple German province entrusted to a governor. Basically, the RSI was a collaborationist state, a puppet of Nazi Germany, with extremely limited autonomy and subject to the needs of Germany itself. The RSI represented a brief but intense chapter in our history, a chapter marked by violence, divisions, and tragedies. Born amid military occupation and political and social crisis in Europe, this chapter failed to establish itself as an autonomous state and was inevitably swept away by the war. Studying today, in 2026, the Italian Social Republic, which ceased to exist over 80 years ago, means grappling with complex issues, starting with the issue of collaboration, which until 1943 had concerned. And we have seen this in other videos that you can find on the channel. Other similar situations. Think of Vichy, think of former Yugoslavia with the Ustasha or the Domobranci, think of Northern Europe, think of the Soviet Union. Those were different situations. But from 1943 onward, collaboration became a key term in the Italian context. But that wasn't all. There was also the resistance. There was the individual and collective responsibility to face after the war. Studying the RSI today, it is an exercise in historical memory that helps not only to understand the past, but also the roots of contemporary Italian democracy. Every time you hear someone say that fascism, all things considered, died on July 25th, 1943, every time you hear someone say that fascism was never radicalized, every time you hear someone say that fascism was not anti-Semitic, well, by studying the history of the RSI, you will discover that these are all tall tales. They are all lies. The RSI represents the most extreme phase of fascism, in which its darkest internal impulses resurface, revealing the darkest, most violent side of fascism itself, the side that is the most frightening, and that clearly denies with obvious facts all the stories and lies that have been fabricated about the 20-year period. A 20-year period that was supposed to be a land of plenty, but in reality had sown the seeds for what would come after, for the war, and for the birth of what is the true, fully developed product of fascism, with all its facets and with all its aberrations. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of our mini-series. An episode that I promise you will be very interesting, because it will focus on the conclusion of another mini-series, the Civil War one. Are we talking about liberation or civil war? Stay with us.